Okay, well, welcome everyone. I have my computer clock is saying that we are at just about the top of the hour. So welcome everyone to this webinar from Library Advocacy Academy on leadership and management. My name is Cinthya Ippoliti. I'm the instructor for the certificate series for this particular topic. And you can find all the information on the Library Advocacy Academy website if you're interested in getting more information about these areas in more detail. I use she, her pronouns, and I am the director at the Library Library in Denver, Colorado. And today we'll be talking a little bit about some pressing topics around both leadership and management. So this is kind of a very broad overview of some of the issues that we cover, certainly in the certificate, but as well as just more broadly in general. And I'm really hoping that we can have this as an interactive session. If you do have questions, please add them to the chat. And I'll do my best to answer them. It may be more difficult for me to answer them as I'm going along, but we'll certainly take questions at the end of our time together. Please feel free, in addition, to let me know if you're having any tech issues, and we'll make sure that we get those we'll troubleshoot them for you. And I see some additional folks coming on, and we will go ahead and get started. And so welcome everyone. I'm excited for our time together, and I will go ahead and get started with the presentation. So today, as I mentioned, we'll be talking about leadership and management topics, a wide variety of topics across many different areas. And what we'll be talking about are a couple of different sets of issues. So we'll start by chatting about leadership challenges, which really start with thinking about who you are as a leader and your values. We'll talk about leadership communication. Communication is really, really important across many aspects of the work that we all do. We'll talk a little bit about employee recruitment and retention and developing a culture of care and dealing with change, which is happening across all of our institutions and organizations. And finally, we'll talk a little bit about preparing the library to advocate for support, which is desperately needed, whether, again, you're in an academic or public or specialized library. We'll talk a little bit about what it looks like to create an advocacy plan and tell the library story. And finally, how to engage with your stakeholder community. And again, this is really meant to be a broad overview of these issues. It is meant to apply, hopefully, to academic, public, special libraries alike. And it certainly does not apply to folks who are just in formal leadership positions. These issues, again, take many shapes and sizes and really can apply across a wide variety of kind of positional elements. And so you don't have to be in, like I said, a formal leadership capacity. It's really very much about kind of starting from where you are, what your goals are, and what your intentions are as well. So with that, we'll go ahead and get started. So we'll talk a little bit about defining your leadership values and communication approaches first. And so really, leadership values are really important because they help kind of drive who you are as a leader and how you want to show up and how you make decisions and communicate. So it's really, really important as a first step to think about these elements. And it really starts by kind of asking yourself several questions. So it really starts about thinking about what you care about the most. And you can start by really just making a list. Try to start by making a list of as many things as you possibly can to start with, and then really start to think about how you can narrow that list down. You could typically start to think about picking maybe top 3 to 5 values and perhaps ranking them as well. And so some may be more important than others, and maybe some may be more context specific than others. So the idea is that this list of values, which could change certainly over time, is kind of your guiding principles or your guiding approaches, and really help you determine, again, how do you want to approach your style, your communication, your decision-making, how you engage with colleagues, how you engage with stakeholders. And some, you will find that some values are kind of there no matter what. So for example, I'll give you an example. A couple of mine are humility and trying to bring a curiosity to the work that I do. And I will share that those two in particular kind of stay with me throughout the time. It doesn't really matter what I'm doing, or what activity is happening or what situation. Those are a little bit more permanent for me. But there might be others where you might say, well, I bring the value to this particular situation. So for example, if your institution or organization might be undergoing some budget reductions, some guiding values might apply more specifically to that particular situation. And so, in addition to kind of thinking about these values, you can also think about what are the things and experiences that have shaped you. How have these challenges that you've experienced helped you develop? What are your strengths? What are you passionate about? What are the big issues of importance as they relate to your job, your career, or your personal life? And I will share values can also be personal, but in this context, we're talking about your professional values that, again, kind of help shape your work. And another really important thing to keep in mind about this list is you're thinking about this and how you might go about creating a list if you don't already have one, is to make sure that these are values that are important to you and not what you think other people might want you to say your values are. So this is about you, and only you can determine what these look like, how these change over time, which ones might be more emphasized and in what context, and how these really shape your approaches. And so again, it's not about, well, I think everyone would want me to say I approach it this way or that way. This is really about you, and kind of they make up your experiences and your kind of perspective. But I think, again, it's really important to start thinking about these elements at this individual level, because then we'll be looking as we move through our time together today at how these might show up at an organizational level as you do kind of operationalize some of these values into your actions and your behaviors, which are really the two areas that then are driven by your values. So one of them, as I mentioned before, is this idea of leadership communication. So communication is a complicated topic, and I've devoted a couple of slides to this, but you'll see that the concepts here are pretty complicated. And I will also share, I forgot to mention this kind of at the top of the introduction, is I did provide a reading list of all of the articles that I've used to help create this presentation. So hopefully you will be able to access this information after our session together, and then you can definitely refer to that as you go along. So don't worry about trying to capture all the names and articles here. You will have that information as part of the recording and the slides as well. So we can kind of start by thinking about communication in a kind of a wide variety of perspectives. There's certainly interpersonal communication, which we'll look at, as well as broader organizational communication. And those are really the two facets that are kind of at play here. But really, kind of getting an initial definition of communication, I think, is important. So I refer to Milton Mayfield, who talks about communication as really interpreting reality, which sounds kind of interesting, right? And sort of the perception, so the perceived articulation of how tasks or problems are presented and resolved. So everyone's experience is a little bit different. Everyone has different information that they are working with at any given time. And so, especially if you are in a more formal leadership role, certainly it is about bringing that information together to the group and making sense of it and analyzing it and thinking about what that means for the work of the group or the organization kind of going forward. Tommy Yuvinen discusses the importance of narratives and storytelling as part of this work. And what does that really mean? Not just the story that the library tells to external stakeholders, but that library employees and colleagues tell themselves about how their engagement and their perceptions are shaped within a particular team or group or library. And we'll really look at this external facet of storytelling as we talk a little bit about how you can share the library story with stakeholders externally as a form of advocacy. But the power of stories is important because they really tap into the emotional aspects of our actions and our behaviors, and they compel people to take some action. And so the idea is, as we'll explore, is that you really want for the audience of the story to really see themselves as part of the story and have a role in the story. And again, that includes ourselves as well. How do we see the organization being shaped by us and each other? And how do we interact and engage with each other? And then Deborah Barrett talks about communication as a controlled, purposeful transfer of meaning by which individuals influence a person, a group, organization, or a community. And I will emphasize that there is sort of a kind of another aspect to this. Certainly, it's thinking about who controls that information, how that information is shared, in what format, what are the implications of those decisions, what does that mean for that influence. And so certainly it could be misappropriated or misused as much as it is used for that purposeful and more positive intent. And then broadly, there are about 5 characteristics that make up just about kind of any general communication. So it's about having communication be honest, clear, consistent, transparent, and how is the audience, again, receiving that information. And again, all of this is truly relative. What might be honest or clear to me might not be the same for another individual. And so the more that teams and individuals can have a shared understanding of what these elements mean and look like in practice, the better, because exactly that, because they are very subjective and it is a complicated set of concepts to think about. And it's certainly not something that you're ever kind of done with. It is certainly an evolving work, and it does take work and thought and conversations about it. It's not something that necessarily happens organically. It's certainly something that I've encountered in all the institutions I've worked in is, you can't certainly ever say, well, we have everything's perfect with communication. There's nothing to change. There's always something right that can be improved. And so talking a little bit about how communication happens at the interpersonal level. And you really want to be thinking about how you can have assertive communication that is still kind. So the 3 different levels of communication that are kind of generally described in the literature are the passive, where the person's rights are being violated because they're not able to express their thoughts, their feelings, and beliefs. The aggressive, which is sort of the polar opposite of that, where the information that is being shared and the way in which it is being shared is inappropriate, is hostile. You're kind of imposing that on someone. And there's sort of hopefully that middle ground where it's clear communication, the assertive level of communication is clear, and there's a mutuality where both parties feel like their rights are being protected, and there's empathy and clarity and kindness in the communication. And so this type of communication really involves stating what you want and focusing on your role and your part of the conversation. So you can't really control necessarily how other people act and behave or what they are thinking, but you can certainly make a request of that person. And this is really talking about kind of setting a boundaries. And how do you do that in a way that, again, is kind, is empathetic, is clear, but also helps you feel like you are getting what you need and establishing that boundary. So it's describing a very specific behavior. So when this occurs, this is how I feel, or this is how it is impacting the situation. You are stating the problem. This is causing a problem because you're outlining the change I would like to, or could you please? So again, this is your request of the other individual. You're explaining the reason or the benefit of why that change is important. This will help the situation or me personally, or how will this help? Get the commitment. So can we mutually commit to making this change? And then thank you, of course, thank you for being willing to consider this. And then kind of practicing this over and over, making adjustments as needed, being able to say this step worked really well, this step maybe not. And so it's really, again, kind of developing a blueprint, so to speak, for how the communication and that interaction occurs. And if you're having a challenging moment or a challenging situation, being able to have this type of a framework can really help, because typically where the interpersonal communication problems occur is because there is a lot of emotion on both sides, or both parties, I should say, or on the group's part. And we'll talk a little bit about organizational dynamics as well. And then it becomes more about, well, I'm right and you're wrong, or the other person is right and I'm wrong. And then it becomes emotional, and then the communication tends to break down. And then you start to see some of those other passive or aggressive elements kind of come in. And then the actual goal of the communication is not being met. And that's where typically then you start to see, again, that conflict coming in. So speaking of conflict, this is also, again, thinking about it at the individual level, but then thinking about also at the organizational level. And so you want to think about what kind of conflict is happening. So not all conflict is the same. Sometimes it is truly a more personal or personality driven conflict, but other times it is a difference in values. It is a difference in perspective, or it could simply be a more structural conflict, which means we're disagreeing about a particular workflow or way of doing something. And so again, depending on the type of conflict that you identify, it will help you figure out how to address that particular conflict. Typically, when you're having this kind of conversation, you are going to want to start to reframe how the other party or the other individual is conceptualizing the conflict. And, it's also really asking a lot of questions. So again, we're getting back at that sort of moment of curiosity where you are trying to understand. That doesn't necessarily mean you agree with the other individual's feelings and interests. And you're trying to remove, again, that charged language if appropriate. Sometimes it isn't appropriate. There is something going on that does need to be addressed. And you're trying to actually restate the problem. So again, what you're trying to get at is what is important to them? What are they concerned about? Regardless, again, of whether or not you agree with it. The first step is trying to understand where that person is coming from and what their perception of the situation is. And you're checking for accuracy. And this is not paraphrasing. So this is a slightly different kind of a tool set to try to apply when you're having this kind of a conversation. And it really does help to kind of try to step outside, as difficult as it might be in the moment, to try to sort of step outside of that moment and try to apply these skills while they are happening, so that you are able to then kind of be thinking about this as it's happening. And this really does take a lot of practice and trial and error, and seeing what works and what doesn't. The other way that you can kind of approach some of these elements is through this idea of Pyron's funnel, which is kind of, again, a broader framework for how to approach a more challenging conversation or situation. It's talking about what information are you trying to collect. So again, you can say things like, help me understand. Agreeing on the issues that need to be addressed in the first place. So again, this gets back at this idea of what kind of conflict or issue or situation are we dealing with. Agreeing on the criteria to solve the issue. So focusing, again, on the interest, not the position. The position is you're right, I'm wrong, or I'm right, you're wrong. The interest is what are we trying to accomplish and why is this important? And then finally, what actions must be taken and who is responsible for kind of doing what, and how will we know we are successful in accomplishing this work? So some of these elements certainly can be applied at the organizational level as well. And again, it takes some introspection, thinking about it for yourself, how this might apply to you and what you're dealing with. It might also take some conversations at the group level about what this looks like within the group, and how can some of these elements be brought into the conversations to assist with team and group dynamics. So we'll go ahead and pause here for just our first quick activity. And I'm going to go ahead and end the slideshow, but I will drop this link into the chat. Hopefully everyone will be able to access this Slido. Whoops, excuse me. I'm going to go ahead and escape here so that I can drop this link into the chat. Let me see if it'll work. And then hopefully you will all be able to access this link, and I'm going to open up the poll. And so I would like everyone, and this is anonymous, by the way, so I will not know who is saying what for any of these activities that we're undertaking. And I'd like to ask, what is your most challenging communication issue that you're dealing with at the moment? And this is an open text, so you should be able to just type in your response into the text box that appears through Slido through the link. And I'll wait just a few seconds for folks to be able to provide their feedback. Thank you. So I'm seeing so folks are having different communication styles. Okay. And so I'm wondering if some of the tools that I just talked about might be helpful here to come to some agreement about at least how to approach the communication or a particular conversation, and having them maybe take turns in terms of trying to sort of facilitate some of those skills and approaches to be able to communicate. So employees who ignore actually employee emails, okay, or ignore emails, excuse me. So that's a challenge. And so one way to be able to maybe have that conversation is to have a meeting with them and ask them what might be happening there, why they're ignoring them. Are they not getting them? Are they not able to respond? Kind of what is happening there. So top-down communication. So sometimes it's about the timing of the communication. So that's where, again, those issues of clarity and transparency and timing come in. And so I think some of the challenges that I'm seeing with the different styles or feeling stuck like different values is, if possible, being able to have some conversations and having some shared agreements about what that looks like. And it could be that those are truly situational. So for example, when you're talking about, administration sending down some communication or sharing some communication, having some agreement about what does that look like. And I realize that it's really difficult to be able to bring these issues up with an administration or with a particular manager or supervisor. But the more those are understood and clear, the easier it is then to address what is working and what isn't working. Or maybe it's asking questions like, could this information be shared in a different way or through multiple channels or in a different format? And making some of those requests. I don't know if that's always possible, but hopefully some of the tools that we've just talked about, will help with some of these issues. Thank you all for being willing to participate. This is more or less how we'll structure the rest of the activities in our time together. So I'm going to go ahead and close this poll and take us back into our presentation. Okay, so we're going to move from communication to talking a little bit about supporting employees and some structural tools for how to do that. So one of the things that we can kind of think about really in terms of employee support starts from the very beginning, from the recruitment stage. So one of the areas to consider is thinking about when you might want an internal versus an external recruitment and what that process looks like. So external hiring is typically great if the organization is changing, if the skills are not already available within the particular workforce, or there is strong employee support for kind of the direction in which the organization is headed. Thinking about internal hiring might be great if the organization is more stable, there are specific skills that are already available. You are trying to maybe, promote some folks or provide new opportunities, but there might be, not as much training available. And so really thinking about that internal versus external recruitment is a really important first step. The second important step is the interview process. So you want to really look critically at your interview process and think about, why does it look the way it does? Is it just historically, this is what we've always done? Can there be some areas for improvement? Are you, for example, if you're asking for a presentation, is it asking to provide more detail and knowledge about the institution, or do some free labor where you're asking someone to kind of solve an issue for the organization? You want to make sure that you're asking, that you're sharing the questions with the candidates ahead of time if possible, and you're anchoring those to the job requirements, and that you're not asking things that are inequitable or otherwise problematic. that you're not really looking for this idea of fit because it is very subjective and subject to biases that are there. Could someone without experience successfully answer these questions? How are you going to communicate with individuals? Can you provide some kind of touch points along the way to make sure that the candidate is feeling supported along the entire process and knows what's going on? And then can you maybe give an opportunity for candidates to chat with someone within the organization, either during or before the process? And again, share as much information as you can about what to expect as they're headed into the interview. So this idea of retention, again, still speaking, kind of structurally, is then kind of comes sort of the next step. So you've hired the individual, you've thought about this recruitment piece, and you're ready to do the onboarding. And so you want to think about kind of what does the 30, 60, 90 day and possibly longer onboarding plan look like. The first kind of initial level is compliance. So that making sure that folks understand policies, procedures, guidelines, kind of how things work. This is really basic onboarding practice. And then clarifying what the expectations are, how, again, evaluations are conducted, what does that look like, the culture, so what are the norms, how does networking and communication engagement occur, and then the kind of the deepest level, which again takes a little bit of time, is thinking about connection. So how do you connect with others? How do you form relationships and giving meaning to just being at work, and what does that mean for that particular context? And then really further down the line is thinking about career planning with the employee and thinking about building relationships with colleagues, with mentors, with peers, alignment, making sure that everyone knows how they are contributing to the vision and mission of the library and the work that's happening. And then growth. Can there be stretch assignments, mentorship, some more formal learning opportunities? Can there be a programmatic mentorship model? Or is it more informal? Can there be some career development goals and activities and tracking of progress? And again, this depends on the library's practices and guidelines, on the broader organizations. Sometimes it's, a campus or a centralized HR that provides some of this as well. So just being really mindful about these opportunities and kind of structuring them and integrating them into that employee experience from the beginning all the way through kind of when they've been integrated into the organization and then beyond. And we'll look at some additional ways that can happen. So some additional ways that this can happen as well is through this concept of stay interviews, which is kind of the opposite of what we have seen kind of as a general practice as done as an exit interview. So typically the exit interview happens as the employee is leaving the organization, and by then it's really too late to make any changes to have retained the employee. And so we just say, well, it'll be for next time. And then that happens again and again and again. So stay interviews happen at regular intervals with employees who are currently in the organization. And it can be a powerful retention tool because you're continually seeking that feedback about ways you can improve while people are in their roles. And then that means also that changes can be made as you go along the way, rather than after the fact when, again, it might be too late. And then you might want to think about compensation planning. So again, compensation is a big important driver of employee retention, if not necessarily satisfaction. And again, we know that we are all in fiscally challenging times across libraries, but it's important, if possible, to do this type of work. So it's thinking about how you're going to structure the work, who's going to be involved, how you're going to structure that process, what employee groups you're going to prioritize. Do there need to be compression adjustments, equity adjustments, both? If there is a progression or promotion pathway, is everyone clear on what that looks like and how to get there? What kind of data are you going to be collecting? Maybe doing some peer comparisons or benchmarking, and how will the data be analyzed? It could be that not everyone would get a raise or get an adjustment, so making that very clear from the beginning. But again, doing some of this work can really go a long way towards supporting employee retention and engagement. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and pause. I went through that section pretty quickly, and I want to make sure that I have enough time to get through the rest of the content. So I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing and go to our next activity here. Just as we did before, I'm going to drop the new link in the chat. And I'm going to go to the next poll here. Oh, whoops, I'm sorry. Where did I? I might have messed that up. Hang on just a second. Oh, there we go. I just had the polls in the wrong order here. So what are some strategies that you have either used or could use based on what we just talked about to address some employee recruitment or retention issues within your organization? And I'm hoping that too, as folks are typing, that you can see that not everything, requires a fiscal commitment. Obviously, that's important, but some of the things like stay interviews, for example, don't. So just thinking about kind of, again, that broad array of options. Stay interview is great. I'm glad that that's helpful. I agree. I think having openness about the promotion processes and what compensation looks like and what can and cannot be done is really, really important. And then I really like this idea too of the consistent check-ins and providing space for discussion about development and career growth and what your goals are and what training or other opportunities there might be to help achieve those goals. Absolutely. And pay equity. And that's, again, those are those things that have to kind of happen on a regular basis, or if there is kind of a big push to get everyone sort of at the same benchmark to begin with, what did that iteration look like? Because it's not something that you can just then sort of set aside. It's a continual process because, as we know, paid things change, and then all of a sudden compression was taken care of in one area, but maybe equity comes up in another. So continually kind of being thoughtful about that. Great. Thank you all very much. Let me go ahead and go back to my presentation here. So now we're going to talk a little bit about some less tangible things, which is really talking about having a critical culture or culture of care. And so this idea is that this, again, is everyone's concern. Organizational culture is important for everyone. And hopefully everyone can see themselves as part of this work and can see a role for themselves within this work. And so the idea is that this idea of culture of care is that it acknowledges that all of these systems, that our personal or individual or team efforts, are interconnected and certainly influence each other. And then thinking about how the contextual and systemic factors that we're dealing with, and any kind of things like well-being or wellness initiatives help serve employees in as an equitable manner as possible. And so thinking about how can equity and well-being be at the center of those efforts, and how can you engage employees, again, as a collective together to really prioritize their expertise, their experiences, and bring all of those to bear when you're talking about how to help improve organizational culture. And then, so for example, you could do things, if possible, what do work schedules look like? How do they have access to, a physical and mental health support, promoting work-life balance, and designing as much as possible for diversity and individuality. And a big aspect of this type of work, so being able to even have these conversations, and again, you'll sort of hear this echo throughout the presentation, that a lot of this requires to have conversations about these topics, is this idea of psychological safety. So can we even have these kinds of conversations? Is there space, literally, figuratively, available for us to be able to have these conversations? In some cases, yes. In some cases, that might be more challenging. So how can you do that? So this idea of psychological safety was developed by Amy Edmondson, who describes it as a shared belief, and let me move my window here so I can read it, a shared belief held by members of a team that the team is safe for interpersonal risk-taking. So what this means is that the group is agreeing to show up with humility, with curiosity, with interest, that leadership especially is inviting that engagement and that feedback, and their response is productive, even if it's getting feedback that is difficult to hear. And it's really, according to Brené Brown, an environment of rewarded vulnerability. which you need to be able to work together with empathy and creativity. And there's kind of 4 elements that comprise psychological safety. So feeling like you are being included so that you are accepted and belonging for your unique identity, experiences, and what you are able to bring to the organization. It's being able to ask questions, of exchanging feedback, of being able to experiment and make mistakes and not be punished for that. It's being able to, again, celebrate the skills, abilities, and knowledge that each individual brings. And it's being able to push back and say, hey, this could be done better, or how about we improve this, or let's look at this a little bit differently. So those are kind of the main aspects of psychological safety. So I invite all of you to kind of think about where you might be. And again, it's a spectrum. Certainly it's not a kind of all or nothing, but where you might be maybe along that spectrum. Do you have less or more of this, and how could you maybe perhaps improve it? Is there room for that improvement to happen within your organizations? And so another piece of this is talking about managing change. So as I mentioned at the beginning, we are in the midst of change all the time. Change is constant, right? That's the one thing that we know we can kind of count on. And so change, as we've seen in more instances than not, I think we all can have examples of when change did not go well and why that was. And so I know this kind of might seem obvious, but I'm just going to repeat it to make sure that everyone understands why the change is happening, and the employees must kind of value that need. And sometimes it's external, some forces that are beyond a library's control or an individual's control. Other times it is more internally created, where the group says, no, it's time for us to be able to do this. And they must also be ready for it. So are there the tools in place that can support the change that is going to be happening, and to be able to actually implement it? And again, there's different types of change that can affect how the change itself will be communicated, implemented, and assessed. So change can be structural, kind of like conflict, right? It is individual, it can be structural, some crisis can occur. It might be an organizational, behavioral thing. So there's lots of different ways change kind of shows up. But as with everything, you want to make sure that you are being thoughtful about this change process. So who is going to be part of the change, and who's making sure that you're thinking about who's also not. So thinking about this in equity-centered terms, who is being included and who isn't, and being thoughtful about that. Being able to, again, be very clear and open about why the change is happening, what is happening, how will this affect people, what does this mean, and how the team itself that's going to be looking at the change is going to communicate and make decisions. And how can that transparency and that openness be modeled and talked about and discussed? So change, again, typically, unless it's a kind of a more of a crisis moment, it tends to happen in kind of a transition. So it's not an all or nothing. It's not typically, again, it's not an overnight thing. And so you want to be thinking about how your communication, both about and sort of through the change, is influenced by the different stages that William Bridges developed. So the first stage is this idea of letting go, where you are kind of thinking about what the change represents and what might be lost. And what is stopped or no longer being done or accomplished or done or achieved, and what does that really mean? Then you're entering this idea that he calls the neutral zone, which is the most challenging of the zone because you're sort of in between stages. You've sort of let go of whatever the previous state was. You haven't quite entered the new state. So this tends to cause a lot of anxiety for people because it's very unclear, and there's still a lot of questions that are part of this stage. And finally, you're kind of in this new beginning, he calls it, where you are reshaping and have new understanding of the values and the attitudes and the change that has occurred. So again, you want to make sure that you're thinking about how communication flows through these different modes of transition. You want to make sure that you're sharing what you do and don't know. Provide ways for people to ask questions and engage with the information that is being shared, so that they understand, again, how the change will affect them. Why? So the most important one is why. and try to be as, again, open as possible about how you are charting progress and movement through these different phases of the change process that you're undergoing. And finally, you want to assess the change. So was the change itself successful? Has the organizational culture changed, and to what extent? And that's a really challenging one to kind of effectuate, because it's not something that necessarily can be easily measured. You can't say, well, we were at a 5 and now we're at a 7 kind of a thing. So you want to be thinking more in terms of outcomes. So what was the elements that were kind of went into the change? What happened? What were the deliverables? What was the impact to the stakeholders? And sort of what were those observable or measurable kind of milestones? So kind of an easier example of this is, for example, if there's space renovations, how did that go? Were people, how did they move into a new space? What were their perceptions? How are they working differently or interacting differently as a result of that change? But there's, of course, many examples of how this model can be applied, again, to kind of measure some of the less tangible forms of change, especially as it happens at that individual level, which is more challenging to determine. Okay, so I'm going to go back into our activities. I'm going to ask the group to talk a little bit about what aspect of change or change management do you feel are most challenging? So this is a different poll. This is actually a voting poll for us. So I'm curious to see where folks might feel like the issues around whatever change you're undergoing within your organization, where the challenges are. Ooh, okay. It's always fascinating to watch this in real time. Okay. Okay, so I'm seeing the resistance piece. So again, I'm hopeful that as you're kind of thinking about what stage of this transition that resistance might be happening, that you might be thinking about some strategies. And I will also just posit this. Sometimes it's not so much about resistance, but again, maybe a lack of understanding of why things are happening, of the process, of the communication. So be thinking about how that resistance or perceived resistance is being shaped by the stage at which this is happening. So the resistance might look different in the neutral zone, again, where there might be more anxiety or personal anxiety happening, maybe that at that new beginning part where it might be a little bit more about the logistics or some other aspect. So be thinking about that. I think that's kind of an interesting sort of element to consider. Okay, thank you all for voting. So I'm going to actually go back because I have a second set of polls here, and we're almost at the end of our time together, and I want to make sure that I cover all of my content. So we're going to move forward through the presentation. So we're going to come up to kind of the final couple of aspects that we'll talk about today, which is advocacy. So we've done a lot of looking at internally within the library, talking about how we communicate, how we think of ourselves as leaders and as employees, as colleagues. We've talked a little bit about how to support each other through more structural and cultural ways, and talking a little bit about change. Now, finally, we're going to talk a little bit about how we work with stakeholders and advocate. So advocacy is really about a promotion of a cause or principle that leads to a specific goal, and typically does not involve a confrontation or a conflict. So it's not an adversarial, it could be, but it typically is not an adversarial endeavor. It's thinking about what you're trying to achieve and why. So again, that story, and we'll get to that in just a second. It's talking about what your resources are and what your strategy is, and who your partners and perhaps some of the opposition might be. It's thinking about having an action plan. So what are the actual steps that you will take to carry out this effort? And how do you know if you were successful, what worked and what didn't? And so how can you be defining progress? So it's really thinking about three aspects of progress. And again, these are difficult to measure because sometimes it's difficult to know whether or not you've achieved your goals, because advocacy tends to be a long-term endeavor. It's not necessarily a super quick, well, we accomplished a project. It certainly could be, but it typically is more of a longer term effort. So you want to be thinking about, was there raised awareness as a result of this effort? Is there an increased understanding? Has there been a change in knowledge or skills? Or has a practice or policy changed? And again, this is thinking about that bigger systemic level change that could be impacted by your advocacy work. But having a plan and going into it with this plan or this kind of framework really helps to figure out how you're going to approach it, who you need to be talking with and why, and how do you kind of develop and deliver that message. So this is where working with stakeholders is really, really important. And why is that important? Well, they can provide a reality check, they can offer insight, they can provide feedback, they can help you with your efforts and provide recommendations. And it's also really important to think about who your stakeholders are. And you want to make sure that you're thinking about yourselves and each other as stakeholders as well. It's not just about external stakeholders, it's about internal ones as well. So there's kind of four types of stakeholder groups. So it's the implementers who are doing the actual work, the day-to-day activities. It's the decision makers, which are often the group that we most want to try to influence with our advocacy efforts because they have the authority to say yes or no or make a change. The participants are often the ones that are served or impacted by that particular program, activity, or initiative. And the partners are the ones, again, that are there to support you and help you. So there's a wide variety of engagement frameworks and methods. You can establish a formal partnership. So MOU is Memorandum of Understanding, a project. You can have a collaboration through things like focus groups and workshops. You can simply be pushing out information via different communication channels. Or you can have things like advisory panels or boards or have a consulting capacity. And you can have different methods. So you can have, for example, ethnographic engagement methods, which include conducting interviews or observations, or even in some instances, drawing things where you're collecting direct data about user or stakeholder behavior, or user experience studies where the stakeholders are telling you what they're experiencing as a result of a particular process or activity or some kind of engagement. But again, the idea is that you're thinking about who this network is, how are you going to leverage it, who you need to work with, who is your participant group, what kind of feedback you're going to be collecting, and how can you put all of this together to create that comprehensive stakeholder plan, but also advocacy plan. Okay, so we have two more quick activities that we'll be doing. So this next one is thinking about how you are going to engage with your stakeholders. And you know what? Let me see if yeah. Sorry about that. Hang on just a second. I think I missed, well, we can just type into the chat. I think I missed creating a poll for this one. So if you want to just type into the chat is who are kind of your stakeholders and what might be some engagement methods that you could employ to gather some of this information. So generally speaking, who are your stakeholders? And I will go ahead and go back to sharing my screen so that you can kind of remember the different groups that I had. So who are your stakeholders? Are they implementers, decision makers, participants, partners, maybe all of those? Maybe you have stakeholders in all of those categories. And what do you think some engagement methods might work with those particular stakeholder groups? And just go ahead and please type that in the chat. And I apologize. I thought I had a poll for that one, but I did not. I'm going to keep an eye on the chat. And as folks are typing, I'm going to go ahead and move on to the final portion of the webinar. Okay, so the final piece to all of this is telling the library story. Advocacy is about storytelling at the end of the day and creating that compelling argument to support whatever cause that you are trying to further. And so you want to be thinking about the different elements of storytelling. So you want to be thinking about kind of what type of story do you want to create? Is it a testimonial where you're trying to, to have people talk about how their situation improved as a result of engaging with whatever, again, program, service, tool? Is it some kind of partner or organizational achievement? Is it a cool new thing, or is it a promising practice? Is it a lesson learned? And then you want to think about the format. Is it a brief elevator pitch that you are, just summarizing the main points of the story? Is it a paragraph spotlight that provides a little bit more information, but it's kind of a blurb? Is it an executive summary of sorts, like a one-pager? Is it a broader 2-page success story as a best practice or highlights something? Or is it a full report that you are sharing out more broadly? That, again, typically includes things like graphs, photos, and just much more information. And then finally, you want to be thinking about your role within the community. And this idea of community engagement. So you want to be thinking about kind of what is the role of the library within the community. And the Urban Libraries Council has these different categories. So educator, or raising awareness of specific topics or issues, a conversation starter, creating forums, for discussion or developing strategies to address issues. Visionary, where you're truly launching a really broad vision, or Center for Democracy. And this might apply mainly to specific libraries, but it's this idea that you're bringing together people to talk about broad social issues that are occurring. And again, you want to be thinking about what are you trying to accomplish? How are you going to connect this role with your outreach work that is happening more broadly? So again, all within this idea that as you are thinking about your role within your particular stakeholder community, you're identifying your role, who your stakeholders are, what is the story that is being shared, and how does that get all put together through your advocacy efforts. And again, thinking about the assessment and the indicators of success. And again, how are you going to be collecting data, and how are you going to be kind of packaging all of this together? Okay, so hopefully now I have the correct link here. So this next link will be asking us which is the role that you are seeing for your library. And I hope I have the correct link here. Great, so I'm seeing one for educator. So if I did this correctly, it should show us a word cloud here. And I realize, again, this is not going to be kind of an all or nothing type of list, certainly, but there might be some roles that resonate more given, again, your context than others. Great, so I see the educator, which I think, again, makes a lot of sense for all libraries, right? That's certainly why we are here. So yeah, it's kind of it looks like a kind of a tie between visionary and educator. That's great. Great. I'm going to go ahead and stop the poll and go back to my presentation. Okay. And looks scary, but this is my list of references. So once you hopefully have access to this, and I'm happy to share the slides as well, you will be able to access all of these resources that I talked about. So I'm going to go ahead and just stop sharing altogether, and I'm happy to take any questions that you might have in the last few minutes that we have here together. Thank you all very much. And I see there's some questions in Q&A. Okay. Thank you all. Yeah, I just realized chat was disabled, but hopefully you were able to type it into the Q&A. But please go ahead and feel free to ask questions through the Q&A, and I will be happy to answer. Any questions about anything I've talked about? And I realize it was a lot of information in a relatively brief amount of time, so there might not be any questions at the end here. Great, thank you so much. I'm glad that this was useful. I hope that it was. If you do have any further questions, I'm going to go ahead and put my email in the chat. Please feel free. I should have put it in the slides. I thought I had it, but I will go ahead and do so. Spelled everything correctly. Please feel free to reach out if you have any questions. As you're thinking through, looking through this content, again, happy to share slides as well so that you can access all of the resources. I want to thank you all for your time this afternoon. I really appreciate it. Again, I wish you all the best, and thank you, everybody. Take care.
All right, fantastic. Thank you, Cynthia. I'm going to go ahead and